Alright guys, welcome to another video. You've got Mr. Everything English, and in today's video we are looking at the clash of the Titans. Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz, which in our world means an inspector versus Mr. Birling. Guys, on one hand you have Joshua, who was undefeated. No one had ever taken him out. He was 6'6", 245 pounds, big, strong, beefy looking man that looks physically intimidating. This was Mr. Birling. Mr. Birling was big, he was strong, and you did not want to mess with him. He'd never taken a loss. He had never ruined his perfect record. Every battle he went to, he came out victorious. Nobody messed with him. Eva Smith messed with him, he took her out. Got rid of her. To the point where he killed her and her baby. So guys, Mr. Birling was not the kind of person you want to mess with. That is our Anthony Joshua. But, what goes up must come down. On the other side, you have Andy Ruiz. Chubby. Mr. Chubby. Guys, Andy Ruiz. Same height, well not same height, a little bit smaller. 6'2", a bit chubby around the edges. Doesn't look mean, doesn't look powerful, doesn't look as though he's here to cause some damage. Now that's the inspector. The inspector, when he arrives, he comes in wearing a black suit, looking quite plain, quite innocent, doesn't look very powerful, but he can pack a punch. Just the way Andy Ruiz upset the world and knocked out Joshua, that is exactly what the inspector does. Round after round, round after round, he wears down Joshua. Round after round, the inspector, he wears down Mr. Birling. And by the end of it, it's a complete KO. Let's go through it, guys. So, round one begins. Round one begins by AJ in complete control. Round one begins with Mr. Birling in complete control. He's there and he's mocking socialists. He's called them cranks. He says community and all that nonsense. So guys, he's completely in his element at the beginning of the play. Round one is an easy 10-9 round to Mr. Birling. No one challenges him, no one comes in his way, no one bothers to even speak against him, because if you do, he shuts you down just the way he shuts down Eric when he says, "To war I say fiddlesticks." So guys, round one goes to Mr. Birling. Round one goes to Anthony Joshua. But round two begins. Round two begins and the inspector arrives. Now guys, the inspector, it says, need not be a big man, but he creates an impression of massiveness. He looks important. When he walks in the room, heads turn. Who's that guy? Now, guys, Andy Ruiz, our chubby boxer, looks very, very friendly. Looks very, very innocent. Doesn't look harmful. But guys, as soon as he enters the play, as soon as Andy Ruiz gets warmed up in the fight, guys, Joshua takes notice. Mr. Birling takes notice. When the inspector arrives on the scene and Mr. Birling's trying to intimidate him, trying to say, do you play golf? Do you know Colonel Roberts? And he's giving very short answers. Very short, very succinct answers. It shows that the inspector is not here to be intimidated. The inspector is here to put out Mr. Birling. So guys, round two is a bit of a feeling out round, where I would say not Mr. Birling doesn't win, but the inspector also doesn't win. It's more of a draw, where they're both talking to each other and they're both feeling each other out. But there's a very early sign that the inspector is about to take control, and this was because of the sharp ringing of the front doorbell. Guys, something sharp, it cuts through. It's like as soon as the inspector arrives, the inspector cuts through the speech of Mr. Birling. He's letting him know, listen my friend, I have now arrived. So the way you were yammering and the way you were stammering and the way you were talking needs to stop. So at the moment, Mr. Birling has run around. Round two was a bit of a draw. Now, as things heat up, the inspector takes control. After this point onwards, Mr. Birling is not winning any rounds. Andy Ruiz, aka the inspector, guys, the inspector begins questioning Mr. Birling, and then he begins questioning Sheila. And his manner of questioning of these characters shows that he has no regard for the presence of Mr. Birling, shows that he has no regard for the position of Mr. Birling. So if in your exam you were given a question on power, and maybe how does power change, or how does power move from one person to the other, you want to really focus how the inspector takes a lot of Mr. Birling's power through the way he questions him. Guys, when he questions Mr. Birling, he doesn't let Mr. Birling lead the questioning. He asks, he expects the answer, and then he stops. He's not there to have a chit chat. He's not there to have a conversation. And a clear example of this is when Eric and Gerald try to come and have a look at the picture, and he puts his body in the way. He don't care who you are. It's his way or the highway. And that really upsets Eric and Gerald. But at that point, guys, it shows you that even though the inspector is alone and you've got Gerald, Eric and Mr. Birling, he's not intimidated. He's not concerned. Alright guys, so round 3, the inspector comfortably wins. Guys, then we move the play on a little bit, and then we have Gerald, and then we have Mrs. Birling, and then we have Eric. Now, I'm not going to go through each account, but I really want to give you a few examples of where Mr. Birling loses a lot of his power. One example I want you all to focus on is I want you all to look at the stage directions. The inspector starts the play by cutting in. Then he cuts in sharply, and then he cuts in massively. And it shows you from those small, little, consistent stage directions that the regard for the power of Mr. Birling has now become null. There is no control. By round 4 or round 5, if you want to call it that, there's no power left. Complete authority, complete power lies in the inspector, and this is through the stage directions. Second thing I want you guys to focus on is the part where the inspector begins to question Eric. When the inspector begins to question Eric, Eric asks for a drink, and the inspector says no. Sorry, Mr. Birling says no, and the inspector says yes, and Mr. Birling says okay, fine. Guys, it's a small event, but it's an event that shows how even as a father, the inspector has no respect for Mr. Birling, and therefore Mr. Birling has no authority over his children. And that part where he shuts him down is very, very powerful, because we learn as a reader that Mr. Birling has now lost complete control. He has no control over his family, he has no control over the situation, he has no control over nothing. And that's why by the end, in round 5, round 6, in Act 3, Mr. Birling almost begs the inspector. He says how, I'd give thousands, yes, thousands. He's begging, saying, take my money and fix my problems. The same man who was at the beginning of the play, crossing his arms, sticking his chest out, talking about, do you play golf? Do you play this? Do you know Colonel Roberts? Now he's saying, I'd give thousands. Take my money, I'd give everything. Now, guys, strategically, as the play has progressed, you've seen the character of Mr. Birling be broken down. But something's very important here. The inspector lands a knockout blow, and he tells Mr. Birling, as well as the rest of the family, that if you don't change, you will burn in fire, you will burn in blood, and you will burn in anguish. So the inspector, Andy Ruiz in this case, doesn't land the knockout blow himself. He says, I'll give you a chance. I will let you stand. I'll give you the 10 count. But you must fix up. You must learn to defend yourself. You must learn to not take jabs to the body, not take punches to the face. In our terms, that means start treating people well. Start being just. But guys, Mr. Birling does not change. And that is why by the end of the play, the phone rings again, and that is the knockout blow. that is the nail in the coffin. Because now his punishment is coming for real. The first fight was a warm-up. Mr. Birling didn't learn his lesson. He didn't learn how to defend himself. Therefore, they've got a rematch. But this time it's for real. This time it's the real inspector. This time it's the real punishment. And that is how you look at power in Inspector Calls. Just the way AJ went from walking the earth as though he owned it, walking the boxing ring as though he owns it. The inspector came to humble him in the first fight, and he did. And now the rematch, let's see what happens. But if AJ hasn't learned his lesson, he will be humbled even more, and this will be the nail in the coffin. The inspector, he came to humble Mr. Birling, to tell him, listen, learn your lesson. Because if you don't learn your lesson, your punishment is coming. And what did he do? He did not learn his lesson. And therefore they have a rematch. And the punishment is coming for real. So guys, when you look at power and Inspector Calls, look at power as going from here, from Mr. Birling to the inspector. It's a complete shift of power. Now, by the end of it, you can argue Mr. Birling, after the inspector leaves, gets a little bit of power back, but I would argue that by that point, it's too late. He's been exposed so much in front of his family that he'll never go back to being the undefeated, the undisputed champion of the world.